Hi, I'm Dan Thompson. Welcome to this short form video on anatomical drawing. The focus of today is going to be the neck, and I'm going to draw for you on Strathmore drawing paper, which is this kind of paper. It's the 400 series Strathmore acid-free paper, ideal for pencils, and I'm going to be doing the drawing in various grades of two kinds of pencils. One is called Tombow Mono 100, and the other one is going to be called Mitsubishi High Uni. These are my favorites, and I use them for a lot of demonstrations and for a lot of classes and things of that nature. So like I said, the concentration of today is going to be on the neck. We're going to try to treat it as a brief tutorial on some things to think about regarding the neck. And I have two things right off the bat that I'd like to cover related to today's information. The first is a common form that we will utilize to think about the neck, and it's called a cylinder. And so I've got a cylinder right here. Many of us will think of the neck as a simple rounded form tilting in space, and that's okay. What we're going to find out today, among other things, is that there are many planes involved in this cylindrical form and ways of interpreting the human neck that will get us a little more closely observant as to what we are drawing. So that's form number one. If you want to practice a neck, look at a cylinder and try to understand how to draw structurally a cylinder in space. The second involves the spiral. So one of the ways, let's say one of the questions that might arise in a class is, how do I make a spiral? How do I make that line which curves so eloquently in space? So I learned an old trick from a former teacher of mine, the great John DeMartin. And what he did was he lined out a piece of paper, he made horizontal and vertical lines, and then he made a simple diagonal which I've indicated in red. So what you do is work that onto a sheet of paper and then roll the piece of paper up, which I'm going to do. So once you have that positioned, then you start to look at things that you might imagine suffice for the imagery of the sternocleidomastoid, or other elements, many of which are present, even predominant in the human neck. So drawing spirals and drawing cylinders are great ways to start in your study of the human neck. The next thing I want to get to is the actual inspiration for today's drawing. It came out of a series of sessions that we've been having at the medical school, the Thomas Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. So the last drawing of which was this drawing in particular. And this drawing focused obviously on the back of the human figure, and this was actually begun on that format because we were working from a cadaver and we had this particular kind of view. We couldn't hang the figure from a central support and whatnot. So I turned it this way, and I tried to focus mainly on a muscle called levator scapulae. So this is levator scapulae working its way back toward a thing called the scapula. And the scapula, you can see, is covered by a number of different muscles, which we could talk a bit about in a moment. There are various other things, though, in here. And this is part of the reason for the video, is to just shed some light on this information so that it's not a total mystery to you and to others when we draw. Many of us are already familiar with a muscle called sternocleidomastoid, which is here. But there are other things that I want to show you in 3 dimensions that I will then use to draw 2-dimensionally and then turn my attention from the 2-dimensional study in graphite to an actual drawing from life in this video. So let's talk about the model now. Beginning from this and trying to create a bit of continuity between the drawing image and the sculpture, you'll note that I mentioned levator scapulae driving down in this diagonal direction here. So I have levator scapulae in this model, but it's a little buried at the moment, and I want to take a look first and foremost at the fullness of the form, which is a big part of drawing the neck. We want to look at the neck as an absolutely 3-dimensionalized form in space. We can't forget that when we draw the neck. The second thing is maybe to get at some of the layering. So let me put this down for a moment and talk about what I've tried to create. This is what we call in the business an écorché, which means without skin. An écorché sculpture as a kind of aestheticized human figure has been a tradition of ours going back many generations. So the way that it also works is, of course, you model from deep to superficial, from the forms that are underneath all the way up to the surface forms. And so the forms that I modeled last in this are the ones that you're seeing up on the top of the surface. So levator is buried deep down within this structure. Here it is. I may use this instead. So the Ticonderoga points out levator scapulae. Part of the interest in decoding all of this is to look for that kind of structure. Then if I rotate my model, I've got the obvious trapezius sitting out here like the great canopy that it is, having a wonderful turn and exhibiting a certain kind of passage of the light as it moves from the acromion area, which is this area here, fresh with the acromion process, over back toward the posterior aspect of the upper body. So underneath of trapezius is a muscle called splenius or splenius capitis, and you can see those very subtle groove marks which are indicative of both the fibers of the muscle as well as of the hatch marks that you might want to use in a drawing of this type. As I mentioned before, I've got levator right next to it. Levator here. And then as I move from posterior to anterior, I begin to encounter the scalene muscles. So I've got these small muscles called scalenes which will sit in this region, and they become instrumental in sandwiching the brachial plexus as the 5 nerve roots emerge, and you can see that I've tried to include them as well. Here they are. So these are the nerve roots, and then the brachial artery modeled in plastiline. This outlier form here is a muscle called omohyoid, which you can see sometimes when your friend is excitedly explaining something and there's an odd diagonal in his or her neck as they, talk about something. So I'll turn this around. You can see now this is what we call the anterior aspect of the upper trunk / the neck. And I obviously have my clavicle bones here, which are these great S-curved structures that move fluidly from lateral to anterior. And I could even turn this up a little bit and show you how they move. My sculpture is, anchored to the base so it shouldn't fall on the floor. And then as I drop this down, this is why I brought up the idea of the spiral, because I've got my sternocleidomastoid which is sliding down and twisting as it moves from this sort of lateral posterior aspect. Again, I can turn it this way slightly. I'll even echo the surface plane as I drive that direction, so that by the time I wind up down here at this base at clavicle, I've moved entirely differently in a surface context from the back of the form, really from the back of the neck, all the way down to the front of the form and the front of the neck. In between these two wonderful curtains of the sternomastoid, with their strappy, flattened quality opposing a rounded, cord-like structure on the medial side, I've got an indentation which is shaped somewhat like a V. That V is where the throat lives, and there's a lot of interest in looking at the structure of the throat, looking at things like the thyroid gland at the base, next to the trachea, which is barely indicated in this model. Looking up a bit higher, all the way up to the thyroid cartilage, the great Adam's apple, sometimes centrally located, sometimes not. And then topping out at a bone called the hyoid bone, a great horseshoe-shaped bone. So I've tried to model some of that essential structure and look at the richness of the neck and what it can do to inform me as to its relative sense of placement, structure, and geometry in light of all the other forms that surround it. The last thing I want to say is this is obviously an unfinished or in-process portion of the model. I wanted to include the jawbone the mandible bone, because it really gives us a nice frame of reference for looking at the neck, because we're all very familiar with this. We draw this all the time. We look at it very carefully, but for whatever reason, once we get south of this border, things don't generally take up much of our attention. So the purpose of this mini tutorial is very much in light of getting us to look more carefully at this region. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start by drawing this model, placing it in a position which mimics the pose, using a couple of lights, and I'll do that for you in a moment. And then once I get to a certain position with the drawing, I'll start to draw myself and see if I can work off of the model, the three-dimensional reference diagram, and take it from there. You're probably already noticing that the video is coming in and out. It's starting and it's stopping, and that's very much the intention with this video. At the risk of boredom, which I hate doing to the viewer, I want to focus on the poignant moments of today's explanation and thereby save a lot of time. I'm not very interested in fast forwarding because I'd like to focus again on poignancies within a drawing that can help explain the material. So what I'm doing now is I'm positioning my model in two to three different light sources because I want to get plenty of light on it and in it and make sure that I distribute the light and shadow shapes accordingly. As I set this up, I'm reminded a bit of this. Many of the viewers will no doubt remember who this is or know who this is. This is Dr. Paul Richet, and this gets me focused a bit more on the explanation, which I should have done more of prior to this portion of the demonstration. So I obviously have a rib cage which has its own particular beautiful shape. The rib cage itself reaching around and giving us a very peculiar kind of angle as it moves from this sort of lateral anterior corner back in space. This is obviously governed quite a bit by the sternum of which can be broken down into a number of different pieces. There are really three, but I can't show all three on this because I haven't included the xiphoid process. What I have shown is a portion of gladiolus, which again has its own peculiarities and character, its own width, its own prominence, its own kind of articulation as the gladiolus runs up into the manubrium. And then the manubrium itself, being a kind of plate, trapezoidal, multi-plane structure, has very unique attachments to the sternocleidomastoid, which you can see I've drawn in here and modeled so that I get a definitive attachment to the manubrium bone. Obviously, I've also got sternocleidomastoid attaching to the clavicle bone, and I position those somewhat on an extreme position next to manubrium. They're probably not that loudly placed, but that's the way that écorchés work. They're a little bit of an exaggeration. This is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's done so very much for instructive purposes as we go through the motions. I talked a bit about the throat mass, so I don't need to get into that. This is the structure of the mental tubercle on either side, and there just is a lot of information that is a corollary to itself, that communicates with itself as one goes up and down the model. As I move away from the model, I've got information which is related to the first rib. The first rib sinking underneath of clavicle very obviously, but then not so obviously lifting up aggressively as it moves up toward the back of the body. And I tried to put that in early on in the model, which has since been covered up. Then I've got my second rib, my third, and my fourth, and that's about where it ends. It's because of that that I don't have my normal 3 bands on my pectoralis minor coming off of the coracoid process. I only have 2. Let's see, as I rotate this a bit more toward me and move past the brachial plexus, I'm getting into my short head of biceps, which is also coming off of the coracoid process. And that moves me into these very unique, faceted pieces of the humerus bone, the most obvious of which is the lesser tubercle, sitting as it does right out facing front or anterior. A bit lateral to this lesser tubercle is the long head of the biceps, and then I have gone ahead and exaggerated supraspinatus as it reaches over the top of the head of the humerus and attaches itself to the greater tubercle of the humerus bone. Out here you can see I've got some acromion process, which is separated from this distal edge of clavicle, and that seems to be about it. As I said before, this is a short form video, so I don't feel like it's the right forum to talk about these structures and what they do and how they move the body. I think it's more a matter of setting these things up as three-dimensionally as possible and looking at the aesthetics of the body. We could maybe do that in another video at some other time. So what I'll do now is position this model for myself, and then I will work a drawing off of this model in graphite that I can then reference my own head with as I look in the mirror for a second drawing. So now I'm going to start the drawing to pick out a portion of this model and put it up on the paper. And to do that, I'm going to use a Tombow Mono 100 F grade pencil and a blending stump and a simple kneaded eraser on my Strathmore paper. So as I get going, my objective is to select the right scale as well as the placement that I can then utilize as I look in the mirror later on in this video. So what I'm going to do in order to orchestrate that is just kind of focus on longer lines. Whatever lines will travel and whichever lines seem best to grab onto, at least initially, those are the lines I want to use. Now, we all have a tendency, when we do this, to just take a wild guess at what we think is going to work. And once again, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with guessing. The thing that's wrong, and the habit that you do not want to ingrain in your working methodology, is to overcommit. So as I lay out a few markers, a few placeholders, as I like to call them, they're merely intended to articulate a sense of what they are, so that I can then gauge the relative positioning of all of these elements. So I certainly have my neck in mind, and this angle here is meant to represent the angle of the sternomastoid coming off there. So some markers are going to be more prominent and more important than others. That's just natural. But it really takes a little while before one arrives at a presence in the drawing where the drawing begins to kind of sing the way a color study will sing and talk back to you in a way that makes you feel like you're onto something, that you've established momentum, and that you can run with it. So until that time happens, you just play around with your developing image, considering the line work in some sense like the clay. Flexible, adaptable to things like scale changes. Flexible because everything's got to move to accommodate everything else until the harmonic placement has been solidified. I find it best to do this linear first. I also find it ideal to pick and choose the full measure of my focus. That is, I'm not interested in the arms later. I'm going to go ahead and leave the shoulders out. I'm going to place the clavicles in here, and I think I'm going to limit myself to maybe pectoralis minor and certainly manubrium, and that way I can work in between noted perimeter markers. That way I can identify and really accommodate changes which are inevitable to a drawing like this, where I'm going to decide this goes here and suddenly it might be better over there. So as long as I draw it with a sense of the fullness and the feeling for the whole, I generally do okay. This is my jaw shape. And the aforementioned mental tubercle coming off of that. And then each and every one of these diagonals, in addition to being like little mini statements about action, they are communicative with each other. Everything talks to everything else, but in a raw visual sense. So the beauty of that is just to keep an open mind, to allow a conversation to be struck up between colleagues, and to just stand back and bear witness to it and try to facilitate a better conversation, a more poetic conversation, as the case may be. So that's my primary focus. I am not interested in finishing a drawing right now. I simply want a fine start. I want to get things rolling. One of the, of course, unique and beautiful, sublime even, things about the neck is the manner of relative placement, that you could strike one line and hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different elements on both sides. And it's even a measure of how much rotation is involved in your piece to check that on both sides, to cross-check that, because as I sit and look at this relationship, it's altogether different, mandible and trapezius, from that relationship. So that could be a compositionally interesting thing to keep in mind as one is pursuing a finer depiction of the neck. There really isn't that much more to add, so I think what I'll do is pause the tape and get my block in solidified. So I'm continuing in the same phase I was in a moment ago, but I'm a little further along. It's exactly, like I said, the same idea, which is the block in, which is organizing a kind of series of markers that point and gesture to each other and work almost like a woven tapestry into the impression of what we want. So you can see my markers are a little thicker. I'm still working with exactly the same pencil, by the way. And they've been better considered, well enough to give me the impression that it's time to refine just a bit more, and then to move into a different phase of drawing this particular model, which would be a phase of shape relationships. So we know from drawing anatomy that no matter how profound a sense of anatomy we can carry with us, we still must rely pretty heavily upon the visual, the optical. And that's what shape and gesture are going to give us. They're going to give us a sense of the pitch of the form, the lean, the gait, the gesture of the body, and the long line relationship of the markers. But also, as I begin to squint down in a moment and go into the shadow shape and the light shape, I can then encompass certain pieces of what I might think are mosaic-like components of this drawing and group those together. And many of you have seen this before. By grouping them together, they become area-driven. One is looking at, in some sense, the core of that particular blocked out area in light and dark. So I'm going to work this principle into the drawing, and I'm going to get out my stump as well, which is this tool here, the classic tool in drawing. It's an amazing tool for unifying different kinds of marks in a graphite drawing. So I'll take that tool out. I'll think in shape and in line for a good bit of time before I decide to move on to a different phase of the drawing. It might be an appropriate thing or worthwhile to consider these almost like pulse lines that reach and travel, and as I said, gesture, because they travel somewhere and they make a statement. And what they're really signaling to me isn't anatomical, as strange as that may seem. It's purely visual, and visual maybe in the sense of incorporating a beautiful way of trying to depict what we see, in addition to the reality of what's in front of us. So I'm going to lean on this F pencil and, like I said, begin to articulate just a little bit of value, being very conscious of simple, straight mark making. This mark making is likely to disappear, and so I don't have to be too conscientious of muscle striations, muscle bellies, muscle directions. You know, first things first, and let's call it optics in front of anatomy just for the time being. That would be one example. I'm also not after value. I really just want a separation, a kind of binary situation, meaning dark light. That's it. And the more dark light clarity I can disseminate, the better I can work these big tectonic plates of the drawing in harmony with each other as they shift and reform and communicate, hopefully, the truth of what's up in front of me. One of the interesting things about an exercise like this, and many of us know this, is when the dark and the light begins to be well considered, the idea of a form really goes into a second tier consideration, because the dark and light is overlapping forms and unifying certain pieces and becoming its own aesthetic important element. So that's really where the drawing wants to live for a few minutes until we get ready to move on. So I'm going to pursue that. And pull the video for a moment and come back when it's ready to talk about. So I'm back to the drawing, and what I'm really doing is working within the scope and the spectrum of these shapes, trying to target certain moments. You might call them points, you might call them intersections. One example would be in this particular area where the sternomastoid, or the shape that will become the sternocleidomastoid, is being depicted. Of course, you can see that there's some overflow of light into light and shadow into shadow. So I'm really not within the realm of thinking about form just yet. I simply want to grab onto what's there and consider it, in an enriching way so that it informs me and maneuvers into a whole, so to speak. So I wonder if you could pan over a little bit and go right to that point there if you want to. Just show. You could come back around. Very good. All right, thanks. So in working that shape and thinking about its counterpart, which is on this side, those are moments. When I say shape, as I mentioned earlier, these things kind of hinge on certain, I'll say again, moments, and I hate to sound redundant, but there are things that just begin to guide your thinking in a block-in, and those things are the essentials, because we all know that we can't focus on everything simultaneously. It's really the driving force of a few players within the shapes. So this is one of the reasons why I am not going to go for a sped up version of the drawing. I really want to sit and talk about these points here and their relationship to things that we might call centers, but we probably should instead call midlines. So as I look at both this and the model, I'm reminded of a diagonal in there that I certainly want to capture in the drawing that I'm working on. So I've got to invest a diagonal into the shape matrix here and allow that shape to manifest itself into the, we could say, pitch or the rollback or the overhang, whatever you might call it, that elicits a sense that the throat is on the underside very, very slightly. Now, I could always move my point of view, which is the great thing about a three-dimensional diagram, but I'm going to pursue this as far and as long as I think it needs to go. And once I get there, I will be able to move on and then pursue form, look more carefully at form. So part of the skill and the fun of this is the ability to merge different darks into each other, and also to jump over certain lights. So this would be a fairly large and blocking light. So I want that shadow to penetrate that light and relate down to this other shadow pattern. So I do that by squinting down. I do that by finding small bridges of patterned either darker light or shadow itself that thread their way into the rest of the image. Those who do not draw will probably think this is nuts, but it doesn't matter. This is part of what makes the drawing experience engaging and rewarding. It's a self-reflective exercise in learning how to see. So along with that, we have opportunities to remake, revise, and otherwise reconstitute certain things that are going to jump out and become very important for comparisons of life drawing of the figure versus life drawing of a clay model meant to represent some essentials of the figure. So you can see me doing a good bit of that in through here. I'm trying to use this light shape to separate the thickness and voluminousness of that back part of the jaw, which has its own peculiar foreshortening to offer up. And if I can get that shape to work its way out in this region, then I can do a better job of comparing and contrasting its counterpart on this side as I drag one into the other. I'm not quite to the point where I'm ready to pull these forms indiscriminately away from each other and work a sense of construction into the drawing. I'm still really holding on to the idea that, hand-eye coordination is a key thing. So filming as we are on this day of May the 13th, 2020, we're all confounded by this debilitating COVID crisis, and at some point this is going to go away and we'll be able to socially reconvene and interact. But one of the better things about the opportunity to work in shape is this capacity you have to set up something directly in front of you and try to work and reconstruct it. So this is a great way to use your time in a social setting such as we are dealing with at the moment. Another thing worth bringing up at a time like this in the drawing is the capacity to take the center or middle, or as I said earlier, midline related elements and either align them or misalign them so that there's a better sense of projection in the human model, so to speak, here. So I'm going to lean on some of these things and make a proper consideration of the centers, these compartments that organize themselves off of center, off of middle, that now really sit and want to communicate up the corridor of the neck and into the clay model back here. I'm still not that committed to hatch mark. I just want to knock some things back. And as soon as I start thinking about knocking things back, I know I'm maneuvering out of shape purely and simply, out of thinking abstractly, and a little bit more into trying to organize form in space, which is a different discipline, one that needs to be talked about and in some respect dissected, pun intended, from the drawing language and organized as its own specific standalone discipline. It's not the same thing as shape. Shape itself might better be utilized, might ideally be exercised in cast drawing. So if you have time and you have the opportunity, the means, pick up a cast, a statue, whatnot, and set up a drawing pad and see how well you can do with organizing yourself to create the shapes. So I'm just about ready to depart from the pure shape observation, being very interested in the neck and curious about neck-centric information that I can then use in a life drawing from the mirror. As I maneuver toward that moment, I'm going to increasingly concern myself with areas of the sculpture that drive the form in an anatomical sense. So this is a thing called the angle of the jaw, which is going to be critically important to getting set with the mental tubercles. I want these to give me a sense of perspective. So I'm going to look for the other angle of the jaw, and I've got something up there to testify to its existence. And that's going to help me a great deal because I can see that in the original model that I don't quite have the alignment of these two coronoid processes that lift up out of what's called the ramus of the jaw, coming superior to the angle of the jaw, and standing opposed to the condyles back in through here. There is a pretty interesting fray to the entire ramus as you think about it lifting up. It's going to lift this way and it's going to lift that way. And as these pieces become more guidance related, they're forms that we want to build and rely upon as we break away from the shape. So I'm going to go back and forth on expanding the space there to consider the width of that structure. And I might narrow it to consider the depth of what I see between conceptually this moment and what's back there a bit further. So there's a lot more three-dimensional considering going on once one departs from shape. That area is just important to reevaluate as this area is. Now this is our primary consideration for the tape and for today's discussion, but all of this needs to build together. I really want to have a complete sense of that kind of form making as I lift off of manubrium and maneuver through the throat mass and then climb up and over, almost echoing what would be an egg shape for a head. I really want to get that. So that'll be how I can begin to depart, or maybe I should say it better by saying, as I depart, I'm motivated by that thinking to try to set up the proper S-curve relationship in the form and see where it can take me. As I drop into some of these areas, it's the same idea, looking for the guiding moments within the shapes. The thing that was exemplified by that little point of reference in through there. There must be hundreds of them, but they're not all of the same value. That is, they're not all of the same importance. As we look and try to drive home the point of this, we're relying upon the things that kind of congregate around the middles. So let me work toward that end and come back in a moment. I'm back on the drawing and looking at making specifics out of the shapes and building out and doing some changes from what I'm observing in the service of trying to find forms that reach forward and become more significant as structural form. So there are things that take us back to anatomical drawing when we're trying to do this or perform this function. One of those things has to do with just the simple nature of sternomastoid twisting in space and whatever lines I can now gravitate toward. For example, overlapping lines like this one on top of that one. Whatever lines I can grab onto that will serve that purpose. The way that I built the form here is I try to construct something in sternomastoid that feels altogether much more like a tube or a cord. And that's the more projected form here, which goes to the sternum. Remember, sternocleidomastoid. So on the cleido part, here's the flat area, much like a strap, which Bridgman would call the bonnet string of the sternomastoid. And I've got the sternomastoid lined up, fairly simply indicated, and my interest is in getting it to lift up and sail over top of omohyoid, which I have in through here. And I find it really interesting as I draw this form. And as I was building it, I was looking back and forth between cadaver videos and artistic anatomy texts and various medical texts. I find it very interesting that the omohyoid goes so central in so much as it trajects toward various parts of the throat. In this case, it seems like it's looking right at the thyroid cartilage, which is of course our great block. So I'm targeting that with value, trying to darken things down to notate where it sits versus where this little split will in turn sit that allows the two thyroid glands, these great egg shapes, to come together. So between these two moments, I've got something along the lines of a corridor, a midline that's reaching up through the throat. And that's what I want to study. That's what this is all about, because if I can get there, then I can begin to contend with specific triangles that are alive and well in a neck, but which we never really take the time to see. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking or change the whole world of drawing, but I'm looking for enough in this through value to articulate things that can build out form. Another example is here with the clavicle. As the clavicle reaches down and connects with the manubrium, I think I'm going to need just a little more value and perhaps more finessing along the edge of this constructed clay clavicle that I've got standing in for a real clavicle, in order to get it to sit properly on top of the plate of the manubrium. So my drawing is very much targeted for this kind of explanation, and I'm not going to make a faithful drawing of the entire model because it won't serve much of a purpose for this particular conversation. I want the things that communicate the message of the form, the projection of the body, and the intrinsic connections that can teach me something that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. So I pull these lines across and I push the shape over, and all told, I look for that enclosure, that setting, that form to rest very strongly upon this great cylinder or modified cylinder of the first rib, some of which we may see in the figure, most of which we probably don't. And I allow that first rib to serve as a kind of platform that I will then look for in the living body when drawing from life. One thing that is certain is I am going to make the manubrium form out in just about every situation from life. So it stands to reason that I could benefit a lot by just sitting on this and focusing on the manubrium for a few minutes and making sure that I'm aware of how it splits and where its planes are reticent and inspiring. There seems to be some amount of very interesting difference from person to person in a physique sense among different manubriums which populate the planet. And I encourage anyone who's watching this to look for that in the model. This isn't a simple form. and it's not the same every single time. When you look for it and kind of celebrate it, just as you celebrate the clavicle, you'll find subtle differences person to person which really animate and drive the process. One interesting thing about the form itself is the way that it sits back like a plate in opposition rather to the gladiolus, which sits in a very different planar context. So I'd like to be able to send some of that across in this drawing. If I can't because of circumstance, then it is what it is. But what I'm hoping to do with the drawing is to use this as a model to compare to life drawing. So that's why I've got a modified approach, modified with regard to light and shadow and structural indication, and something that I can, again, jettison into life drawing with, so that I've got more than just a flat diagram. So I can look around and adjust what's going on in there. I have no faithfulness to this in the long term. I'm going to adjust this to what I know is happening because I'm trying to set up certain expectations when I draw a neck. For example, the passage of not only sternomastoid, but the way that the trapezius is going to roll through and spill over like a waterfall on top of the clavicle bone. So there is going to be an advantage to indicating some of that and sort of teaching myself via diagram and hatch mark to look for that phenomenon in each and every neck. Another area that I want to be more curious about in the long term is this really strange region that sits just lateral to sternocleidomastoid, just superior or back away from the top of the clavicle bone. And right now it's occupied by the brachial plexus, but that's too simplified and not entirely true. There are other elements that are going to be sitting in there that will catch light, that will maybe not catch as much light as other areas, and give us a certain kind of quality as the clavicle bone is depicted pushing forward on top of the body, which is what we're after. So this is part of the interest in using anatomy to better understand the neck, so that these areas come to life and they're not just regions that we fuzz out when we're not quite sure what's going on. A few more things to get at. There's a passage running up in through here which you see me darkening down, and the reason I'm doing that is just to separate the body of the mandible or jaw from what sits within the neck region itself. There are a few muscles that have great importance to the triangles. There's a digastric muscle which is climbing back and around. And once more, the model is very useful for trying to understand what's going on and then impose that understanding on a drawing, so that that's a reference, and imagination is another kind of reference. Another issue which is very interesting and part of the conversation is, where do these forms go? Where does this land on the other side? Well, it happens to land at a thing called the mastoid process in the back of the ear. So as long as I'm aware of that, and as much as I can think about it trajecting up toward that, that's going to change the way that I not only draw it, but get a sense of successful connection and continuation and elegance in the overall form. You have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, this is still very cylindrical, and there's a lot that's going on with light and shadow that's assisting me in making it look like it's turning around in space, like a pipe or a tube, or as we've talked about a bit, a series of triangles. The other fascinating thing about this form, and many like it in the body, is the notion that if I am going to go after triangles, I need to repeat myself on both sides. Now, in so much as light and shadow can allow, I want to be clear on how it's illuminated from this angle, but it's still fundamentally a kind of triangle that has a partner triangle over here. In this case, it might be this one, or it could be a triangle that's contained up in that area. But we have to be thinking in bilateral symmetry so that we can better understand how this form is going to be drawn, and drawn not only with skill, but great interest and fascination as the figure shifts, or as you talk to somebody in a portrait pose and they change the way that they're responding to you, or something like that. So I'm going to solidify some more points and then move on to the next phase of the drawing. So continuing with the same grade pencil throughout, and the same stump and the same kneaded eraser, I am working to solidify the information on this study so that I can then take this study to life drawing. And again, it's a three-dimensional diagram. I can talk a bit about it and then continue on the drawing. So one of the main concerns and continuing areas of fascination and engagement is this thing called a manubrium on the sternum. The manubrium is the quintessential plate in the front of the body, and is essentially, like I said earlier, a trapezoid, but it articulates, which means connects, with the first rib over here, the other first rib, which I'm dealing with, which is kind of murky right now, the clavicle, the other head of the clavicle, that is the clavicle on the other side of the manubrium, and then these two wonderful kind of funny cord structures from sternocleidomastoid. It also communicates with the second rib down and through here, and also as well the gladiolus. So there's a lot of stuff that is running into and merging into that bone structure. It makes it critically important, and that's why I continue to work on it and refine it. I find myself pulling it to the left, pulling it to the right, but that's a common way of dealing with that type of form, because it does have such a kind of enduring, lasting relationship with center of gravity in the figure, with points of reference in the portrait. It's a classic form. I think I've talked about it a lot already, but it's pretty amazing. So they generally, manubriums, look pretty good when they have a sense of angularity, that is, they are kicking back into the body. So I'm involved in the modeling over here on the right side, just to kind of lay out a placement and to think about how this placement and this placement are echoed by what's going on this side. So I'm going to pull verticals up and down and through, and it's just a really fun kind of thing to be involved in. There's so much material that's going to traverse the body and angle up and in toward manubrium. We're talking about pec major, we're talking about the costal cartilages, the ribs themselves. It's very central, and it's very, very interesting. So I imagine once I get this up to speed, I can take it to the life drawing and actively reference it, going back and forth between the model study of this plate of bone and myself. In addition to that, something funny happens, which is once we climb up and out of the manubrium, we're in this pocket here, which I haven't given a whole lot of shadow to. The reason, if we want to pan over to this side, the reason has everything to do with this kind of piece of clay that's back into the shadow space. We've got the clay, and then on either side of this clay we've got these diagonals, which are my stand-ins for sternohyoid. Those reach up to, in this case, the thyroid cartilage, that great box form. And then I have what I pronounce as the cricoid cartilage below it, which is a singular form. And then below it, even still, is a double form. These are the thyroid glands, which kind of open up and give us this quintessential kind of cup shape in the throat mass. Again, here and here. You don't have to go in and draw all that, but what's really helpful is to think about this area as being indented in the figure, pushed back and off of that plate of manubrium. So it's a great thing to look for. It allows us, when we go back to the drawing, to suggest a sense of pullback in the throat. Pull back away from what? Away from the manubrium. So the more I dive in and kind of deal with this area just gently with the F pencil, the more I am pulling this area back away from manubrium and manipulating the midline as I work my way up the volumes. These are so important as stand-in markers for the midline of the form, and they should, and they do, I believe, angle this way versus angling that way. Keep in mind that along that manubrium, there's going to be a different pitch, so to speak, than there would otherwise be in the gladiolus. So, great things are happening, and it's up to us to find, discover, and celebrate them. So as we move up and through this, we've got that first rib very wing-like as it slides under. So I have every interest in trying to pull the mark making up and through, and I'm rather interested in this relationship with the strappy portion of sternomastoid and just the optical coincidence there of first rib, on both sides in fact. Elsewhere, I'm seeing things in the model that are very helpful and very fun and well worth talking about. Past omohyoid, which is this marker here, I've got a small amount of the scapula, which is helpful because I can visualize better if I see scapula. And as I was saying earlier, there should be a little bit of supraspinatus in that pocket. On this side, I have even more scapula back in through here. So these markers are helping me to think in the round about the neck, to use anatomy to visualize pieces of the figure that are normally complete mysteries. So I look past my plexus, I look past my omohyoid, which is here angling in, remember that? And I arrive at not only a little piece of my scapula, but I find our friend back here, levator scapulae. So there it is, helping us to see how the volume of the neck is going to build out. Finally, I want to make a couple of references to the sliding and twisting form of trapezius as it opens up down here. Maybe the right way to think about it is it moving this way. You can see the thinness of it, almost foreshortened. So if my pencil's like that, I move this way, my pencil opens up, I move a bit further, sort of obliquely, my pencil opens up that way. So the general movement is like this, and it continues along that side. You can see in through here. A really fun and challenging muscle to both visualize and draw. You want to see it hang from the body, hang elegantly, but also, just like in the sternomastoid, you want to be able to visualize, again, that same word, how it pulls up and inserts into that nuchal line in the back, in the occipital area. In addition to that, I decided to go darker, not for value's sake, but for notation, and place these in so that they would project. I also decided to put a couple of hatch marks, a few catch points, to address the big change in the plane as this almost cylindrical form makes a sudden change to articulate the front plane, the true front plane. I also went back and looked at the ramus of the jaw in through here and the angle, and I tried to work a kind of collaboration off of these two angles and off of these two really individualized body, what's the word? Sort of serpentine lines that drop down. So I've got most of my markers. I don't want to push this too far because this is really a diagram to serve the purposes of drawing from life. So at this point, I'm ready to move on into the life drawing, which I'm going to place here, and I'm going to make a reference back and forth to see what happens when these structuralized forms are manifested in a life drawing. Now I'm going to draw myself in the mirror and relate the diagram back to the shapes that I see with myself in reflection. I've arranged the lights on either side, and I've kicked the lights up a little bit more to give some more light and some raking effect across my neck, and that should show me a bit more information about my throat in particular, but I'll keep an eye on it. The beginning of this is going to be much like the beginning of that drawing, where I really have to coordinate shapes and poignant markers and things, and even scale off of what I have over here. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes doing that. It may be a bit difficult to talk during this. So again, same idea, same concept, just beginning to build up shape. I may have to go to shape earlier on this one because I've got more optical relationship to accommodate. Just going to pull this shadow shape straight up into the lower face, and like I said, work some kind of initial plan, left side, right side. Clear out some of the paper. So down in here I'll be able to see that clavicle connecting into manubrium. So I'll move the clip slightly. And it's still a matter of trying to find placement, so I'm going to spend a good bit of time working on that for the time being, and come back when I have a little more of a sense of momentum in this block in from life. Of course, it's worth mentioning that in situations like what we're facing, drawing yourself is a great way of staying purist about your studies. It's not easy to do, but what is these days? So let's shut it down for now and come back. So the shapes of my face have gotten a little further developed, and I'm looking at the neck in particular, and I'm trying to find corollaries. As I said before in this video, it's not really going to work as an instructional video to explain each and every one of these functions. It's more a matter of trying to seek out where the coded three-dimensional model applies to life drawing. So I'm really attempting to prioritize, in particular, this spot right here in my own neck, and I'm searching out shapes that are going to spell that out. Again, it's a little tricky to speak and draw simultaneously on this because this is where my voice box is, but as I target this area, I'm going to work off of this kind of central location. This is right around where the thyroid cartilage is positioned, and in fact, when I draw, I do a fair amount of moving my neck around and swallowing, and sometimes, my jaw and such, so that I can see things like omohyoid fire away down and through here. So I've got some other corollaries between omohyoid dropping down, between thyroid cartilage, as I mentioned, and then I'm trying to anchor the suprasternal notch and get set with this shape in through here. So I'm really looking to instill a sense of reliability, for lack of a better word, on this decision, on that decision, on a few markers here and here, and then obviously on those things which are located here. So as I study this, I overdid the scale on hyoid bone on purpose, on the clay model, and on this drawing. I tried to pivot my hatch mark so that I could make it large, plate-like, and curved. I had surgery from an oncologist in this region, so mine's a little bit asymmetrical in here, but I can find enough of an incised nature in that throat mass that I can then build out and begin to search out what's going to be happening in this area. And that's what I'm going to do next. I also pushed a bit higher into the face region and just got set with angles of jaw. I'm still working up a small amount of reference material in through here, but I really wanted to create this so that I get a sense of the projection of the head. One other thing to cover is that you can see that I exaggerated the sort of the draped nature of the sternomastoids in not only the model but also in the drawing. They don't tend to hang like that in real life, and that's what life drawing is proving out. There's a tautness and a tightness to the nature of the body and the way that it fits together. So that's the reason why I've got this area positioned, so that I can work off of a semblance of curvature and then get back to those spirals in the neck. At this point, I continue working on the pieces that are going to refine information and placement in the drawing. I've got a lot of little markers and notations, which I'm referencing this as well as the mirror to coordinate. And it's really a question of perspective, as well as the form changes and subtle asymmetries that exist in the human face. It's really worth noting that on the underside, just under the jaw, I've got some key moments to look at, and I'm really curious about what sort of form development I've got in here. I've got a really interesting boxy form popping out, and I'm not convinced that it's a lot different in my own throat. I do have the light crossing through. I do see, because I can feel my own thyroid cartilage going back and forth, and as I rotate my own head in pose, I can see that form stuck to the midline. So I'm looking at that, I'm targeting that, and I'm sort of working off of that into different compartments. An example being into omohyoid again, and also into sternohyoid as I drop down. I could see a small amount of a kind of supportive kind of form sense as I look at the thyroid cartilage opening up and sinking into this crevice. And I've begun to coordinate the elements that are going to push sternomastoid back in space on this side. So there's more of a continuity, but there isn't as much on this side. It's a little broken. So what I want to do next is draw just a little bit, probably push that shape over and try to take this indication, that one, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the ear. And, give it the impression of being one form hit by two different light sources. If I'm drawing and I'm always in the mindset of sort of theoretical form creation or development, I can generally draw with an eye on looking past the shapes, referencing the shapes, but not being too faithful to them, because I'm realizing that there's a lot that I've got to interpret. So what I'm looking at this moment is the solidification of that column, that sort of bar that climbs up. And I want to make sure that the light breaks where it should. And at the same time, as it is a sort of bar and almost pillar shape, there's stretched skin back here. There's skin traveling into the crevice. So I may want to pull some hatch mark or some varying tones back in that direction in order to, let's see if I can, instill a sense of dropping back into the body so that that reaches forward and isn't just a chord. It might be transition is necessary. Could be something else, but I'll keep working on that and try to coordinate everything together. It's really an interesting form to see it reach, as we saw here, all the way up and all the way down. And past clavicle, I've got some indications of clavicle on this side and a small amount there, but it really hasn't come together just yet. It's a really important and fascinating lesson in perspective, how this chord or column right here could be covered by the throat mass, yet still be present in a sense. It's like drawing a still life or something. That's got to sit, this has got to surmount it, and then this has got to sit in front of everything. So it's a kind of 1, 2, 3 type of arrangement. So as backdrops, these sternomastoids are really important. I'm also going to put a little bit more time into trapezius, as it not only hangs off the body, but sits even further back, so it backstops the sternomastoid muscle. And so I'll work on that for a few minutes and come back and continue. So I'm back on the drawing and I'm looking for specifics about what I had on this side. The difference now, and what's really great and what's fun to talk about here, is I can get more and more into nuance in the shapes, and that's what these next sections of the dialogue are going to encompass and going to entail. So I want to point out a few things. I'm learning a good bit about how this particular part of the clavicle alters its semblance of self as it works into my drawing. I've got it sitting right above my manubrium, which means I've got to be very measured in my degree of tonality that I use to push the suprasternal notch back, again in accordance with my diagram and my observation. And then in the way that I kind of look at the nice chord of it and how it moves past a bit medial to the edge of clavicle and runs into, again, manubrium. So that's a really key, fascinating area to go and study. Of course, I've got the other side of it here, and I've got a number of different sort of subforms that grow out from there that I want to further explore. And so I'm jumping back and forth between the model that as I'm asking, when I see this and when I note that this is turning back in space just a little bit, can I put some of that into, my own figure, or is it a false impression? So I'm going to try that. I'm going to try other things that allow me to gravitate toward a sort of complete, comprehensive surface structure. So that's how I'm going to use this anatomical information to try to figure out the great plate of the central area of my torso. Elsewhere, I'm lifting up and I'm also looking at some information that's really interesting. This is something that's made too contrasty in the diagram, which is fine. So what I'll do in the life drawing is I'll bring in some tonality here and here so that I can pull the area of throat in this region back in space and get a bit more of that curvature of the neck as it pulls back in space. So that's another thing that I'm looking at. Elsewhere, I've got to begin to flesh these areas out because these are part of that very strange, elusive area of the throat, the uh, sort of lateral reach of the neck that is not entirely trapezius, certainly not clavicle bone, kind of in between. So this is where the work that I did on levator is going to come back to help me, or the work that I'm doing on omohyoid is going to come back to help me, or even this question about the relationship of the flattened portion of sternomastoid to the rest of sternomastoid. It's worth mentioning, under normal circumstances, I'm going to expect to see either some minor impression here that's going to separate cord from strap of the same muscle, sternomastoid, or I might not see anything at all, but it will feel like one long form. In my own case, I'm feeling like there's more of a separation with the sort of lateral edge of this. So it's as though I want to take that triangle and reposition it over here in my own neck. And I don't really know why that is. I think everybody that we look at is a little different. So as long as we have information to move forward with, we can always approach the drawing with some sense of theoretical form making and interpretation, and at least a critical eye on what we think we're seeing, because we're armed with the proper way to see it. Reached the point in the drawing now where I've got most of what I think I'm going to need to push a little further toward a finish. This entire time I've been using the same grade of pencil. It's an F pencil by Tombow, and I've just been focusing on getting more resolution or clarity on the form making enterprise of this drawing. This is the reason why I decided to do this entire visual tutorial in fits and spurts, because this kind of thing can be rather tedious and hard to follow. So I wanted to pause at certain moments and point out things that I think are informative and maybe will save you some time. So a few of those things are as follows. There are some in-cuts here to make note of the corresponding nature of the cord of sternomastoid. I continue to work up a bit higher into, again, the hyoid bone, which is going to push back a bit further. This is a very interesting area that sits above the hyoid bone, always entailing complicated light direction management, as well as the amount of projection of the lower face. So the lower face wanting to come forward, in my case, means that this part needs to feel like it's closing in slightly more. So I was modeling more of a shape in through here and kind of bringing the bottom of the volume down and noting it at this marker here, which is probably on the model on this other side a bit further down than what we have in that case. Still a lot of the geometry. There's a pretty healthy triangle in there. It's just that this obviously has more of a soft form indication, and you might want to say more fluidity as it flows through. So I can't make that hard and fast jaw. I've got to keep it more of an open form drawing throughout. As I look at both sides of this framework, I then lean back a little bit, and one of the more fascinating parts of the neck is right in this pocket here, which is how do we get the sternomastoid to not only sit in a diagonal sense, but begin to communicate the idea that it's turning back that way. This is something that very few of us really appreciate when we draw the model, that it's literally falling and twisting to the other side. And that's obvious in a model like this, and even more obvious in a three-dimensional model, but it's a very difficult thing to indicate. So as I begin to push the range with the same pencil, I'm going to try to further that idea that on both sides, sternomastoid is being forced to the side and twisting and falling backward as it traverses and moves toward the mastoid process on the other side of the body. So as I drop down a bit further, many of these indications are echoes of the kind of structure and the sort of triangles that I'm looking for as I go under the mandible. This sort of so-called submandibular area continues into these areas of the carotid region, and then obviously omohyoid as it descends. So I've got an eye on getting as clear cut as I can in there, but I have to be very open to the notion of falling pieces. And the fact that we're not going to get cut, hard-edged, faceted planes all the time. We really have to be open and considerate about what we're building in a total way, in the sort of complete figure idea. So that entails getting this tube to work itself out, and perhaps even more of a challenge, getting the transition of this area to work more effectively as well. So I'm leaning on topography in here, these neck folds. I've got one here that begins to split off into two. I've got another one in through here that also corresponds to the edge of sternomastoid. And then I've got the notion of working around the corner and what I can do to flesh out some of the triangles in these areas that I'm going to spend a little bit more time with. Also, in the interim between the previous clip and this one, I hadn't spent as much time in that central plate area, the manubrium and the associated drop-off planes of the pectoral muscles. So with pectoralis major, we can see that there's a wider sense. This almost would be a kind of distortion of the manubrial plate, but it really isn't, because we have to remember that on the living body we have areas that have been filled out, so it makes something feel larger than it actually is. It's really quite similar to what can happen in this landmark when someone rotates their head, and that space actually shrinks down because part of the mastoid is popping, so to speak, or firing away as sternomastoid rotates the head, as this one rotates the head, or as that side rotates the head this way. So we're going to take a look at darkening down just a little bit more and trying to clarify all of these areas, plus the bone structure as we go into this last period of the drawing. And after that, I will kick the camera back on and talk a bit about the finish. So with this drawing being just about a completion, I've got a few things that may be of interest to the viewer, which are directions that run through the body. Directions are just incredibly interesting areas to go for. They're very calligraphic, and they're always significant, especially near the end of a drawing. So the directions that you choose are going to have a lot to do with the muscle fiber, with your perspective, with the perimeter of the form. So let me give you examples of each. I've got, let's say, muscle fiber direction going on in through here with the pectoralis major. Also a kind of topographical, almost planar muscle fiber direction in this area as I begin thinking about the form sailing off the edge of the clavicle and into this region. In the throat mass, I've got the perimeter and topography of the neck, which is working around, so a direction like this, a direction like that. Those are going to chisel the neck out and give us a lot more of a continuous sense of form making as we build. You can see that the directions here, the chisel marks as I would call them, are altogether different from the directions that you might see up in an area like this, which turn vertical. And that's because of more muscle fiber direction / perspective, where we're traversing the form headed up to a very prominent under the mouth landmark called sulcus, the mentolabial sulcus, and through there. So I've got directions that are prevalent in here and in there. These are planar. And the ones that I would call perspectival are the sort of implied directions. Sometimes they're physically there. Oftentimes they are the relationship built. That is sort of not so much end of clavicle, but a marker on the clavicle and on the other clavicle, or a marker on the angle of the jaw versus another angle, or on the mental tubercle versus another tubercle over and through there. So as one wraps around these forms, the directions become ever more important for finishing off the calligraphy of the drawing and giving you a sense that things are they're coming together in a kind of visually logical way. We don't have time to work every single form to the nth degree, but we don't need to. If we get an elegant direction, a direction that looks in some way profound, it will oftentimes suffice for a lot of hyper detailed form making, which we probably don't want to see anyway. What you're looking at now is just about the completion for now of this particular drawing, and I wanted to explain a few things in closing off this mini tutorial about drawing the neck. I've rearranged the sculpture in front of the drawing so I could reference a few things for you, so if you want to zoom out a little bit. So what I've attempted to do in this, which I hadn't had before, was to darken down some of these areas, in particular the areas here and maybe back here, that not only caught up against the light, or let's say scraped the edge of the form right at the perimeter of the shadow and the light mass, but there are also areas that capture a lot of attention when it comes to just the sort of territory of the neck, the way the neck looks as you take in the entire form. You'll also notice I've tried to pay some attention to this by darkening down the range, maybe a bit too much in some of these areas and even the contour, but also by dealing with some of the topography in the region here, which I admit I don't really have a name for. It's certainly a triangle, but it's caught up in between, like I said, the trapezius muscle, which is here, and the clavicle bone. A really amazing structure to draw. So I've been aided by that in these areas of the model here, where I can look over and analyze pieces of clay that are three-dimensional and that are broken down as tubes, tubes at different angles. So I've got omohyoid, and I've got the plexus, and I've got angles like the scalene angles that are dropping back and giving me the wherewithal to try certain things out. So these are not really angles as such. They're more guesswork that is an educated guess based upon the trajectory of scalene, or the trajectory of levator scapulae, or things that otherwise are usually quite mysterious, because we look at them and we think we can see where they're going, but we don't really think as much as we probably should about the importance of three-dimensionality in trying to evaluate a form which is normally kind of silhouetted when you look at it. So along with that, I've also tried to add a little bit more tonality to the underside of the throat and to play the form back in space so that I can get the feeling of projection. And so that's quite a bit different from this model, where even though we have the triangles, we don't really have the light and shadow. Just like we don't really have the light and shadow in the kind of tapestry-like quality of the sternomastoid. So this is a concern of life drawing, as is the idea of leaving some of these forms open formatted, which means not entirely closed off. We don't really want to close the forms off. We don't want to draw everything localized and separated and contained, because it can tend to look a little bit more like a, kind of a diagram. So that's one of the things that's really great about drawing. It's a searching module and a searching mechanism for you as an artist to go in and try to see better, to see more, and to see things that are active in front of your eyes. Also, drawing from life is pretty spectacular, because things are changing the entire time. You can watch the silhouettes change, the contours change as a result of seeing the model move or seeing yourself shift back and forth or change your point of view. So I hope that this mini tutorial has helped you a little bit in seeing some of the ways that we could interpret the neck, and I look forward to hearing your responses to the video. Thank you very much.